geographer, so what interests me is the geographies of Aboriginal peoples. And what I want to look at is where Métis people are, what their characteristics are in those places, what some of the changes are. Now clearly I can only address some of the aspects, and this is based on census data, on identity maps, and those kinds of things. Clearly there are other kinds of geographies. I know Maria Campbell, for example, has looked at Métis place names, and these kinds of more culturally infused aspects of Métis geography are also interesting. But today I'm mainly looking at census-derived materials based on people who call themselves Métis in different censuses. This is a little bit more detail to the table that Andy presented. It's Métis identity populations in Canada and the provinces, and I've based it on 91 to 2001. And if you look at the population increase, the percent of increase for the Métis population in Canada between 91 and 2001 is 116%. But clearly it differs substantially among provinces, and Andy mentioned that already. What some of the implications are is that provinces that previously had only a small proportion of the Métis population in Canada are now moving up there. So you get, for example, Ontario was 16.5% of the total Métis population in Canada, and that wasn't the case 10 years ago. BC with about 15% of the Métis population in Canada. And you also get a shift in relative representation of Aboriginal people. So where the Métis used to be a minority of the Aboriginal people in most provinces, now they're becoming a much more substantial part of the Aboriginal population. So for example, in Alberta, they make 42% of the Aboriginal population. And you can expect that, if we just look at demographics, to have some impact on the kind of politics of representation that will play out in different provinces. Clearly, what this also indicates is that people come to Métis-ness from different historical backgrounds. And that's been a theme that I've heard a number of times in the conference. Okay? The people who identify as Métis in Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick probably come to that identity differently than some of the Métis in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba. And this, I think, creates increasing challenges for political organizations to find some way of accommodating all of these different sources of identity. If we look at the distribution of Métis within provinces, and here these are all in the binder if you find it easier to look at tables from the binder. I've just looked at Manitoba and Saskatchewan to look at where the Métis are within the provinces. I thought these would probably give us some sense of the kinds of differences that you find. Okay. When you look at where the Métis are in provinces, what's striking is that most of the Métis are in census subdivisions where they are a minority. And census subdivisions are villages, large rural areas, towns, cities, and so on. Okay. So in these two provinces, most of the Métis are in census subdivisions where they make up less than 10%. In Manitoba, you have 6 census subdivisions where Métis make up a little bit more than 50%. In Saskatchewan, you have 15. And in these census subdivisions where Métis are a substantial portion, or the majority of the population in Saskatchewan, as this footnote notes, they do make up a very substantial part of the population, 60%, 70%, 80% or more. And if we look at that in maps, we get a slightly different picture. You know, these are actually, they come out better in your folder, but this tract and this tract come out at 30 to 39. Okay, so it means that almost 40%, between 30 and 40% of the people, just about pointing at the lake there, almost 40% of the people in these two census tracts are Métis. The black ones, there's 50% or more of the population that's Métis. So that some of the implications are that if there are areas where there are opportunities for co-management or substantial participation in politics and resource management, then you're looking at these kinds of areas where Métis, well, if politics are that way. I mean, nothing is cast in stone, right? These are just numbers. But if you're looking at places where Métis make up enough of the population that they can argue that they should participate in co-management regimes, then you're probably looking at census tracts where they make up a substantial portion of the population. If you look at Saskatchewan, okay, and again, I suggest that you look at the maps in your binder because they come out better. But you don't have these huge areas where Métis people make up a majority of the population. These black areas are small settlements, primarily in the north. Okay? But in some of those areas, Métis make up 70, 80, almost 90% of the population. Okay? So the Métis seem to be spread out a little bit more evenly in Saskatchewan. If you look at it a different way, okay, not where do Métis make up the majority of the population, but where are the majority of the Métis people found, then you get a different kind of map. And I didn't want to put those up because you're going to get sick of maps. But most Métis people are found in cities. In Manitoba, 51% of the Métis people live in Winnipeg. In Saskatchewan, 40% of the Métis people in the province live in Prince Albert, Regina, and Saskatoon. So I wonder if we're getting a kind of disjuncture between policies that are based on social justice, policies that want to address social marginalization, which would be in areas where most of the Métis people are, mostly cities, and the advancement of legal theory or rights-based policies that may depend on long-term occupancy, long, stable communities, and so on. And here I'm completely out of my depth because I'm a geographer, not a lawyer. Okay? But it just seemed to me that there might be two different trajectories at work here. Okay. When we look at these kinds of distributions, then we have to ask a different question. Are the Métis that are living in urban areas, are they really rural Métis? Okay, are they just people who circulate? And do people in urban areas continue to have links with their rural communities of origin? And the census can't answer that really, really well. I think you need much more ethnographic material to look at that. But we can get at least some indication of that. And these are some of the same stats that Andy used, but I just want to point out something a little bit different. Or I'm not disagreeing with him, but I want to have a different emphasis. If we look at the registered Indian population, the urban-to-urban migration, okay, people who were in cities 5 years ago and are now in a different city, is about a third. In the Métis population, that's over half. Okay, so over half of the Métis population is migrating between cities in that 5-year period. They're not migrating from the city to their rural area of origin and from their rural area of origin back to the city. Okay? So this is not only are Métis substantially urban, but most of them, when they move to another city. Okay? At the same time, you have about a third that are moving from cities to rural areas in that 5-year period. Okay? So you do have clearly probably more Métis people than non-Aboriginal people who have this connection to rural areas of origin. Okay? But it is not the main pattern of movement among the Métis. Now, we don't know if the people who move from city to city are a different kind of population than the people who move from city to rural areas and from rural areas back to the city. We don't have those kinds of data, especially for Métis people. We're starting to get some of that material for North American Indians, but there's a real absence of research for Métis people.